I want to introduce Neelam Bakshi, who I think has addressed this branch before, but she's addressed lots of trade union meetings, been a campaigner for a long, long time, and she's here to speak about her take in Black History Month, really, and then we'll have a bit for time and discussions. I just want to check before we start that everybody can hear okay, and I'm assuming folk in Zoom can hear okay.
Yes.
I would appreciate it if, when folk are not speaking, if they mute. Oh, sorry, you're being muted anyway. And also, the last thing is to remind people to put their mobile phones in silent, if they could. Thanks. So I'm going to hand you over to Neelam. She'll speak for about 20-25 minutes, then there'll be time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I know I've been in this room, I just don't know which meeting I was attending at the time, so that's kind of the way it goes. And as I'm standing up and looking around and looking at Zoom, I'm seeing that there are people I know, and there's also folk in the room that I recognise from various demos, but I might not necessarily have chatted with you before. So it is quite a welcoming place from that point of view. I don't know that I was asked to put my take on Black History Month, although maybe that'll start to come through as I speak. I was asked to say a little bit about my background and my own activism. And I think my history's pretty unusual in Scotland, let me put it that way. And I'll maybe come through some of that. So I'll talk a bit about my background, how I got involved as an activist and a politician and trade unionist, and then some reflections. And I think the starting point for me is to say that I'm an immigrant. I came here when I was a toddler from Kenya. But all of my sisters are Glaswegians, born and bred. Okay, and my schooling, obviously, since I was here as a toddler, was from pre-5 right through to university, and then the university of life has all been based in Glasgow, and then floating around the rest of the UK doing bits and pieces. One of the questions for me, I thought might be helpful is how did I get involved? What is it that influenced me in politics and representation? And I think I came from an Asian family, an Indian family that was both a bit traditional and also quite progressive in its thinking. So my parents wanted us to have a really good education because, as far as they were concerned, that was the way out of being in difficult circumstances, whatever they were. My dad, as I said, I've already said there were 5 girls in the family. By the time we were finished working out how big this family was going to be, no boys in the family. So I was the oldest, and I was the one that my dad talked about politics. But he was never active in politics in Scotland. He was a community activist, though, and he was involved in public life. And so I thought he was the main influence, and it wasn't until later that I thought, but he only got to do the things he did because my mum was doing some of the other stuff. And she was involved in the community in different ways, and so she was involved, for example, in making sure that there was kind of community activity with the women. And she would be involved in events like making sure that the temple activities were taking place, actually getting a temple in the first place into Glasgow. So I realised that, it was the influence of both of them. And then school was the other big influence for me. And there were 2 significant things I can remember. I can remember lots about school. I'm just talking about this particular avenue. One was at primary. I said that my parents wanted a really good education for us. And so they I had to do the entrance exam to get into one of the what was called fee-paying schools, but they weren't like the private schools. They were the ones that were run by the local education authorities, but they were going to grant aided. And so I did the entrance exam for that and got in. But it was a real awakening for me because I went from one of the ordinary state schools. So I went I'm looking around the room and thinking folk will remember some of these names. I don't need to explain too much, okay? I went from Willowbank Primary School to Hillhead Primary School, okay? And when you kind of think about it, so, the way I describe it now is I went from schools that were being considered factory fodder, right, to schools that were supposed to be training the elite. Wasn't it quite that way? But the biggest difference for me, and what I remember really starkly, was this was a school that taught you music, and I was going in at the age of 8 not having done any. And they had 2 orchestras linked between the primary and the secondary. And I was going from a school where music lessons were singing around a piano in the hall. And it was that starkness of the difference between the opportunities. And I say to this day that shift is what turned me into socialist. It's absolutely from the start. And then the other thing was at secondary school, we were very lucky because obviously being at Hillhead there was a lot of opportunities and music wasn't particularly my bent, so that didn't make a difference. But having good teachers and opportunities to learn a range of subjects did. One of the teachers I had was a communist, which was interesting having a communist teacher in a school like that, by the way. But he taught history and he taught modern studies, so it meant that my class was able to get modern studies as a subject, and I did that as my 9th O grade. And this particular teacher was willing to and gave us modern studies as a class from 4 o'clock till 5 o'clock twice a week. And what he also did was he came in during the Easter holidays, and a whole bunch of us trooped in during the Easter holidays, and the school was open for one class so that we could go an extra module. Now, it turns out that module was local government reorganisation, which was very useful for me later on, okay? But it was local, but it meant that we could actually take an extra subject and do the exam with a bit more at our elbows. And right now, that's for me something about the commitment and the willingness of teachers and how many people put themselves forward for other folk. Real lessons practically about stuff like that. So equality, democracy and justice, and during modern studies, we've got things about World War II and the Holocaust, and we've got things about anti-racism and South African apartheid. So that was all part of my school curriculum, which a lot of people didn't pick up at school. And then later, I got into university and things started to go somewhat wrong for me. I don't want to say a lot about this, but I had quite a traumatic childhood in different ways. And I was actually, and you won't recognise this now, I was shy, I was introverted, I couldn't speak to people. It was not anything like I've turned out, right? And Irene has known me a very long time now. But during the 1970s, a woman called Stella Reiki was a deaconess of the Church of Scotland. And she had managed to get some funding from the Church of Scotland to set up a flat to help new immigrants coming over to Glasgow. And that flat got moved next door to our family home. So I ended up getting involved in sharing the faiths movement. My dad, obviously realising I was very shy, they organised to take me to a committee meeting, and I walked out of that on the committee. And I did that most of my life. I would walk into places and walk out on a committee, And I've got one or two stories of how that happened. But that was, how I describe it now looking back after, and I was 14 then, right? So 50 years on, I would be in the right place at the right time and get a choice, and I would usually say yes and not know whether or not I could actually do it, which is what I started doing then. So helping at my dad's shop and some of the speaking in public in the sharing faiths got me a little bit moved out of that shyness. I went to university, as I said, and I was a medical student initially. And by that time, I'd also acquired a boyfriend whom I'd met at the International Flat and who is now my husband. So Rory, he'll pop up again later on. But he helped me around Freshers' Week at university, and I joined CND and I joined the Labour Club because I was so naive at that point. I didn't even know that. I thought you had to wait till you were 18 before you could join a political party. That's how little I knew about it. Okay, and he said, no, you could have joined when you were 14. I went, okay. So I joined the Labour Club and I joined the Labour Party probably in the same day. And I got active certainly in CND, and I became the treasurer at the Glasgow University CND. And I ended up being able to do a lot of travelling around the country. And I was realising as I was looking at this, that if I hadn't left home, I would never have been able to do that because of the traditional side of my family. And I also know that if I hadn't failed my first university topic, I became very unwell and chucked out medicine. I wouldn't have been able to get involved in any of them because it's such a busy subject. So for me, there's this thing about looking at the things that seem to happen accidentally and looking back at the opportunities that came around because of those things that wouldn't have happened if I'd actually continued a straight path. And it's maybe just worth adding one thing to that history of story, and there's a wee bit more I want to just talk about how the accidental pioneering came around. In that bit of the story, the medicine side of it, for many, many years, and even now they say, do you regret not having a degree? And the answer is, well, if I'd got a degree, I would just have been another Indian doctor. Right? And actually, I've had a much more adventurous life since then. So, around university time, I joined the Community Council and I joined the local Labour Party branch. And a year into the branch, and I noticed that the constituency chair at the time was Jim McKechnie. Jim's in your Zoom, yes. So Jim and I go back a very, very long way here. But he wasn't the branch chair. There was a branch chair, and a year into the Labour Party, I thought I'd quite learn how to do chairing. So I'll stand and be the vice chair, which is what I did. And 2 months later, the chair said I need to step down because of personal circumstances. And they went, "You're hit." And so I was 19 and I became the branch chair. There wasn't a fight for positions in those days. Some of you may remember this, right? So it was easy to do. It wasn't easy to do, and I think the branch were very tolerant of me. Then when I got married and moved, and I became the branch chair of where we moved to. By that time, I had a baby, and we will remember. Well, folk will remember still, that I would just go along and chair the meeting, and my daughter would sit at the end of the table, and she would be sitting there with drawing paper and pens and pencils, and every so often she might have a question, so she'd interrupt me, and I'd pause the meeting and I'd answer her, and then I'd go back and chair the meeting, And that's how it was, because basically we did opposite shifts. My husband did the night shift; he was working night shift, so I did the day shift working and then night shift with the baby, and he did the opposite, because that's how it was in those days. Anyway, I didn't finish either of the 2 degrees I started, and I carried on, as you do when you leave university, you kind of find jobs and you move upwards. I'd been working in my dad's shop since I was tiny. We were working in the evenings in the shop, and evening after school, and at the weekends. And so I stayed in retail for quite a bit, and my first full-time job was John Smith's bookshop. So can you imagine what that was like, working in a place with 6 floors of books, and I became the assistant training officer, so I got to go around all 6 branches. And they were good to me. It was non-unionised, but they were good to me when I got married and had my baby. They looked after me at a time when I wouldn't have been entitled to maternity pay, and they allowed me to. I was the first woman to go back to work full-time in that organisation after having a baby. So this is a little bit about what the culture was like just in the country at that point. Okay. When I left Smith's, I became a civil servant and for the first time I was able to join a union. I think they were a bit surprised, because I joined and I kind of did all the things that you do as a new employee. And then I said, can I find, where is the union rep? So they didn't come looking for me, I went looking for them and joined the union. But things happened again, that bit about how do you get involved in a union. I was on probation, because you were on probation for 2 years. And the union committee called a meeting and said they were all going to step down because they were getting nowhere with management. And it was like, that's not a good thing to happen. So fortunately, one of the folk who joined that particular office had moved across from Edinburgh, a woman that you probably still know. She was then Annie Thorne, is now Annie Shanahan. And Annie basically had come into my branch, and so the 2 of us spoke and said that we needed to get folk. So some of the folk stayed on. She became the secretary and I became the chair of the office, and then both together also in the branch of the union. My husband, by the way, says it was a toy union because it was the Inland Revenue Staff Federation. But it was still a union. It was the one I was allowed to join, so I did. Carried on doing political activity, and one of the things that happened, and again it's just back to what it was like, in those days we had, there was a phone call, and it came through from the Race Equality Council, okay? And the Race Equality said the Labour Party are looking for their black minority members, but they don't know who they are. So they've asked us if we can find some for them, right, which they did. And we went round to a meeting with the Ethnic Minorities Officer from London. And by the time I left that meeting, I was a member of the Anti-Racist Working Party of the Labour Party. And I was also a conference speaker. And at the conference, the main speaker, who was the Ethnic Minorities Officer, missed his flight. And on the day they said, "You're now the main speaker." So that's kind of what I mean by accidentally falling into a lot of stuff, where there was very little choice but to say yes. Okay, career went like that, and I ended up I continued to be active, and particularly active in anti-racism work. And I just want to say a couple of things about that, and we'll pick it up later in questions if you want. I was chairing the steering group that set up the first St Andrew's Day anti-racist rally, the one that the STUC has now taken over and run for several years. But I remember what it was like, and this is really kind of what I want to say. It was exactly like that. We had the far right out on the streets, the BNP and the National Front, and it was scary because you wanted people to go out and make St Andrew's Day a day to celebrate diversity, not a day where you were out fighting the BNP, but you knew the BNP would be on the streets. And we also had a lot of folk protecting us around those rallies. And then around that time, certainly during the time I became elected as a councillor, we had the Gulf War. And I'm sitting looking at these and thinking, I don't know how far we've moved. And I know we've moved a lot, but I don't always know how far we've moved, because it feels very déjà vu to me at the moment. The couple of other things I want to say is that, when I became a councillor, it was, again, one of those things. I was the branch chair, and the sitting councillor said, I'm going to stand down. I went, okay. So this has kind of fallen in my lap, if I'd like to go for it. My daughter was 6, and I stood for it and won selection at that. And it was celebrated a lot in the constituency, so just not to say too much. Say a little bit about the time there, but not a huge amount. That time was interesting because I was the first person from a minority ethnic community to be standing for the Labour Party in any safe seat in Scotland. And I was the first woman from a minority ethnic community to be elected. And so I walked into regional council, where Jim was also a councillor at the time. We had 104 councillors, 90 were men, 14 were women. The Labour, I think, was about 92, I think, and there were kind of 12 opposition. And I was the only BME person in the council. So the learning curve was quick, and it was interesting. I don't want to say again, I don't want to go into detail, but I want to say a little bit about the opportunities that I had in that council. And the things that people said to me towards the end are probably most important. One of the things was that one of the officers said, what you did was you gave us permission to go out and do equality work, because you were picking up the agenda in the council and raising it at committees and making it public and pushing the council on it. And so those of us who were scared or being pushed back with this isn't important, we got permission because you were there to be able to do the work. And I think that was something that I didn't really realise the scale of it in that way. The other couple of things is that it was some of the things that happened, there was quite a lot of skullduggery, and I'm afraid that some of the trade unions were not very good in terms of their visible commitment to race equality, as long as it didn't involve black people that they knew. As maybe the politest way of putting it. And I'm going to give you just a couple of quick examples in that. One Irene will remember well. When I was standing to be a councillor before at this election, my branch members said that a lot of them had been told to vote for the other candidate because they were a member of a trade union affiliated to the Labour Party. And so went doing a bit of digging about afterwards, and I don't want to mention names, but a senior trade union person said, that's rubbish. That's in the MP in selections. We didn't have a Scottish Parliament then. That's not for councils. And Irene and another woman trade unionist managed to find out who it was and went and had a go at him. So that kind of activity. And there was another one that was trade unionist. This was when I got the opportunity. Someone asked me to stand actually against John Maxton in Cathcart. And so I went through the selection process. But as soon as my name went forward, I got roped by a couple of Labour Party, very active trade unionists. One of whom collared me and said, you didn't ask us if you could stand. said, what do you mean ask you if I could stand? Right? Didn't get the permission of the left, apparently. And there was this conversation, which roughly went round the lines of, if we'd wanted someone to stand against Maxim, we'd have found someone locally to do it. Now, I was in Maryhill at the time, and I just turned to this individual who was also in Maryhill and said, so you're asking me to stand against Maria, are you? Maria Fife. I was able to have that conversation with him a few weeks ago. It was okay. Right? But it took us 20 years to have that conversation about how that had gone. So I just want to say a little bit about what it was like. There were super, super supportive people, and there were also folk who really were not very helpful for me at all. I was going to say a couple of other things, not very much more, because there's a lot of history in there. I spent 6 years as a councillor, and it was quite hard coming to the end because the regional council was a good council doing a huge amount of progressive and innovative work. They had the social strategy for the 1980s, which councils have never been able to catch up with properly. And they also were doing a huge amount of work in terms of moving money around from wealthier areas to poorer areas to make sure it was distributed properly. And they unfortunately or unfortunately, it depends how you look at it, they held a referendum about the privatisation of water, where the people of Strathclyde were able to vote against that. That was too much for the then Tory government, and they decided that they were going to get rid of Strathclyde Regional Council and all the regional councils, and the reorganisation happened. For me, I was chairing committees, and the turnover, it was, two things were great. One was that the community who was working with me wanted their committee to carry on, please, because they were really feeling that they were getting some power and democracy and involvement. And I said, you can't, because when the council goes, it goes. So that was one thing. And the second was that so many people were moving into new jobs in that shadow year that I saw a turnover of staff all stepping up to do the work of the folk who were moving on. And so the thing that was really great for me was seeing the number of young people who were behind, who were of really good calibre and quality when it came to officers and councils. And Strathclyde was going to be split into 12 successor authorities. So you knew they were being spread across Scotland, and some of the ethos and the values and the work and the thinking was going to spread across Scotland too. So I wanted to say that because that was a super experience. I wanted to give you just 2 examples of what I did at Strathclyde. And then I just want to say a wee bit about what I'm doing now. Okay, and then we'll finish up at that. Folk can ask, there's so much missing, but I've got it all written down now. So 2 things. One was actually walking into nursery schools and seeing mothers who were waiting for the children, just doing like an afternoon nursery. And so what they'd done was they'd set up a wee room where they could go in and do some Open University modules for free. So they were getting access to some education. And one of those women went on to do an access course and went on to university. And there's maybe others, but there's one I specifically remember from that area. And that's the kind of opportunities that it opened up. And the second was that same group of women, and telling me about the difference it made having a woman councillor. And it was a really simple thing. We just get chatting, and they said, these kind of events, and you see councillors open, how do you get a councillor to go to these things? I said, well, you ask. And they'd never spoken to a councillor before. They were happy talking to me. And they said, so if we asked you to come to something, would you come? I said, I would certainly look at you. I didn't know. So would you come and open our bingo night? I said, yeah. So I ended up opening a bingo night for these women because it was the first time they'd had the opportunity to ask any councillor to come and do something for them. So I just wanted to share those 2 experiences. There was a lot of equality work. I don't want to go into detail. I just want to say a little bit about later on. The opportunities of learning, the things that I learned. I mean, taking, some of you might recall Walter Citrian's ABC of Chairmanship, that time when I became the chair by accident. I read my way through that, but it stood me in really good stead because I've ended up being on a lot of public boards. First, initially, through Strathclyde and then subsequently through open recruitment processes. But it means that folk who think they know governance have a tough job because I know where it comes from when it comes to committees and how they work. So I've been able to use that. The strategic thinking of Strathclyde and learning about, when I went into Strathclyde, one of the things that was said was, this is a council with about a budget bigger than Luxembourg's. Okay, that was the scale we were working at. So I go into most organisations and I've done bigger strategic thinking than most of the staff have. So it's that kind of experience that I've been able to take with me. And so, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things. I don't want to say very much more. I just want to say that, yes, I had an interesting time going for selections for MP and MSP. There are stories there too. Yes, I had some interesting experiences over the years being on boards and the experience of the quiet racism, or the way that you have to not talk about some of your activities because you're not supposed to have a public face. So the only thing I'm going to say is I've been able to be influential in the background on a lot of stuff now, and use the equality experience to do that professionally as well as the voluntary activities moving from activism. I think the two things I want to finish with very simple statements. One is that just that business of saying yes before I knew how to got me into places that were good, but also got me into bother sometimes. So that's just a warning in case anyone thinks that's a great way of operating. Nowadays, I mean, I do work on tribunals, so employment tribunal, which I've now been on since 1992, and went in through the trade union side, and disability tribunals. But I'm also now a court member at the University of Strathclyde, so it amuses me that I don't have a degree, but I'm actually on the governing body of one of the biggest universities, things like that. And then my daughter and my husband. Well, my daughter now has 2 teenage children, one of whom is at university. So any of you who saw me around demos would have seen me with a toddler or in a buggy, or later on, as she grew up a bit. I'm now in my 60s and some acquired disabilities. So yes, still doing stuff, but not able to drive, not able to get around in different ways. So really that question of, so what's my new job going to be? Right, literally is where I'm at in my thinking just now. I'm going to finish on a line which I've put in as the title of something I've still to write for Sunday. Not this Sunday, but I have to get it ready for Sunday. When I turned 50, someone said, "But you don't look 50. How do you do it?" I said, "Hair dye and attitude." Right. So I'll stop there and let you ask me what you want. Okay.
Might take a tip with the hair dye. I'm going to open it now for questions and any contributions folk want to make. First of all, I'd like to thank the speaker for an interesting talk, and now I invite you if you want to ask questions or make any comments. Do.
This might seem a bit bold since it's my first meeting, but does it concern you, the lack of BMA people in this room? And how can that be reversed if it should be reversed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 things to say. First of all, when I walked in, I thought, oh, this is like a lot of rooms I used to go into in the 80s and 90s. And so I think that that's part of it, which is this is a retired members group, so you won't have as many BME people in a retired members group. So I think that's part of it in Scotland. Okay. So some of that will turn over as people who are currently in the movement get older. And the second thing is that I think the second part of it is that as they do get older, there needs to be something of substance for them. And what I mean by that is, if they've had a bad time being a union member, they're not going to want to continue doing that as a retired member. If they've got things that they're going to be engaged in and active in, and remember, just because equality is like one of our interests, it's a big interest because it covers every group. But we're interested in the other stuff like pay and like conditions and like democracy and all the big issues are all there. So it's about the things that like you've done with me. I mean, I'm not active these days, but that's partly because of what I was going to say, that experience of becoming a councillor, where one day you're an activist and the next day you're the establishment. I've done that a lot in my life. But the thing is, if you're an activist, then you want to continue being active in the ways that it's possible to be. So getting some of the trade union members to come in and talk about their experiences of being trade union members might be an interesting way of doing it. And I'm looking again, Anita will know that we worked on different things together in the past as well. So you've got folk that you can bring in where it's not just that they're coming in listening, they're coming in engaging with you about what it's like being a retired member now, for example, and how it's been. And so it's not just about changing what you're doing, it's about changing what's happening in trade unions, and we've got fewer members in trade unions altogether now. So,
Okay. David?
Aye. It's not a question really, it's just a kind of, you mentioned Strathclyde Regional Council's social strategy document. I just happened to pick it up the other week there and another read through it, and it certainly is something the Glasgow City Council has not achieved, and it's something maybe that we should look at, because we are involved in, you know, the attendance allowance, so we are involved in in communities. Having been a community development worker myself at one time, it's certainly something that needs to be looked at more.
thank you.
Anybody else? And one of the things I'd like to pick up on, you mentioned you were at the start of the St Andrew's Day marches, which have gone on and on.
Yeah.
I think this year's one's very important. It's always important. And it's not just a one-off day in a sense, because it's, I mean, if that's all it is, then it's not very good. But actually it's very important that march is bigger than it's ever been this year, because of some of the things we're facing, to the incidents that you mentioned earlier. Their branch's support of that. And also, it was a good question that you asked, but that's an issue for us to take on board. I mean, the point you make is right, there's the wage profile and so on, but actually we have got BME members of the branch. We need to encourage more. There are people out there that are retired that we need to reach out to, and we try and do that, and I mean, we need to be better at it, I think. It's a simple answer to maybe your question. We can't be complacent about things like that, and we have to be reflected in our meetings as best we can, I think. Is there anybody else?
Could I just ask, Neelam, do you think it's a lot better now, or do you think there are still obstacles for people? Say someone bring it forward, someone like you, but today, are there still obstacles to their involvement?
I think I think you're right to say, is it better? And the answer is there are lots of things that are better. And I think it's, I said to Dave when we were coming up, that I hadn't clocked it was a retired members group. So, but that was helpful because I wasn't going to have to set out what the Thatcher era was like. You know, I'd been a councillor during that, because you would all have remembered what it was like. You know, so there were things I could miss out in terms of contextualising. And in a sense, we are worse than we were then, because you can't trust what people are saying in government anymore. And I don't care which party it is.
Yeah, right.
And I should say, by the way, and I didn't, I slipped out of the Labour Party in 2005 quietly. And I was happy to do so because the party had well left me in terms of its political strands, but also for my own needs and the way that things were developing. It was the most useful thing, because I ended up being able to do things I couldn't have done if I'd been a member of any political party. And that's just to do with the way the governance trajectory went. But so that was one side of that. The other side, in terms of has it got worse? Well, obviously, you're getting the lead from America and from people like Boris Johnson to give permission to be overtly racist with a government that's got a hostile strategy and being continued by the current Labour government.
Yeah,
And so the thing is that what's feeding that, I'm not sure. Because this is something about government choices, and it's a general point I'm going to make. Once capital punishment had gone, now capital punishment was very popular amongst the public, and it still is to some extent, but government was clear it was not okay anymore, and it stopped it. So this business of pandering to popular views, right, versus principle, is for me an issue about how our governments and how boards work. So that for me is, who's holding the government to account and who's holding the Labour Party to account, etc., or the whichever party is in government. I say Labour because it's more likely to be Labour if I'm in a trade union room. Okay.
Yeah, I think your question are things did things. I think things did get better, but they've been rolled back again, and it's reflected it's not just the individuals like Tommy Robinson. It's actually state racism, institutionalised racism. Some of us were at the Sheikh Bayou inquiry. There's a man who was, I would argue, murdered by the police, although I'd probably be put in jail for saying that.
Well, you can
And
imagine.
nobody's ever been brought to justice over it. And it's only happening because people have got the family, particularly. I mean, you know that we had a speaker, Sheiku's brother-in-law spoke during the lockdown at a Zoom meeting, and we've been at folk at the inquiry, but that's been running for a decade. And the same thing happened before with a family in Lanarkshire, the Choker family, people will know about. So it's not just the individual, what we have in our head, it's actually been fostered to divide and rule us. I mean, the housing crisis is blamed in too many immigrants stealing their houses. The problem is they're not building any houses for people. It's not anybody stealing them. There are ordinary people can't get houses because they're not being built. So those arguments are coming back in a way that they came in the 70s as well.
As I said, they come in a different form now, but they're the same arguments and the same people they're talking about. And there's just maybe one point to make about that in terms of some of the difficulties and challenges. You've got some weird stuff in terms of who gets into power and why, but the reasons are much the same, because I was looking at who got elected into the Scottish Parliament. You've got your first BME woman, MSP, who was Cockab, but you've got another woman getting at the same time. Very different backgrounds. Cockab stood for the SNP against Donald Dewar for the first Scottish Parliament, right? And then you've got the Pam Goshal, who basically was not known to anybody in Scotland and appeared through conservative networks. So the old systems are still running, right?
Are there any other questions or points that folk want to make? Because we have to move on.
Yeah.
And
I was going to say one last thing, if I
Come on.
could, about it. Well,
Yeah.
it's an experience thing almost again. One of the things that moved me hugely when around the day of the election, when I was elected in 1990, and I was standing in a constituency that was a very white constituency. I wasn't standing in places like Dublin where there's a huge population. And so I took the electoral register and I went through it to identify the visible minority ethnic names. And I wrote to every one of those, and there were 17 families. That was it, 17 families, okay, in that register. But when I went out to the election, one of the polling stations, one of the polling officers said, there was an Asian woman came in and asked us to show her how to vote, because she's been here but she's never voted for anyone before. But because it's you, she wanted to vote for you, so we showed her how to vote. And it captured my interest, and I remember it very well because I remember also the day that voting started in South Africa. And I just wanted to remind people that one of the biggest things that you can do is to make sure that people are on the registers and voting and have access to the voting. Because that's how you change things where the decisions get made, whichever election is we're talking about. Okay, I wanted to make that last point if I could.
They're trying to take the rights away from people again.
Yeah.
Listen, I'd like
Thank
to
you.
thank. I'd like to thank Neelam on behalf of the branch and show a round of applause for that.